spoke, as I said, a little earlier to the Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, and with all this talk of not lurching to the right, keeping it mainstream and so on in mind, I started by asking if he was determined to scrap the Human Rights Act, the law that builds the International Treaty on Human Rights, the European Convention, into British law.
Well, I'm absolutely certain we will go into the next election with a plan for change. I think all of us agree that the current framework for human rights law in the UK is not what we would want it to be. Ironically, if you look at the original convention written back in the 1940s and 1950s, at a time when Stalin was in power in Russia and people were being sent to the gulags without trial, that original document is a laudable statement of the principles for a modern democratic nation. But over 50 years, it's moved a long way away from that. The decisions in the European Court have gone further from those original principles, and we've now got rulings in areas like should prisoners get artificial insemination. So I'm very clear change has to happen.
All right, and on the Act itself, the law that incorporates the convention, the International Convention, into British law, do you see the Tory party promising to scrap it altogether? Is that a possibility?
Well, self-evidently, if we're going to create a new legal framework, we're not going to be able to keep with the framework we've got at the moment. But we've got a lot of work to do on the detail, look at exactly how we best do that, how we deliver change. Right now, I'm not ruling anything in, I'm not ruling it out. But I said this morning, it's inconceivable to me that we would end up with the same legal framework we've got now.
And what about the convention itself, the treaty that Britain signed up to over half a century ago, signing up to that international set of principles? Is there any question at all that we might pull out of that?
Well, as I said, John, I've not ruled anything in, I've not ruled anything out. If you read the original convention, anyone who sits down and reads it as a document would struggle to find a word they disagreed with. It is a sensible balance of rights and responsibilities, of principles for a democratic nation. Yeah. It was written in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Holocaust, all the issues in the Eastern Bloc. What's happened since then is that the decision-making in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has moved, I think, that original convention further and further away from the original intentions of its authors.
All right, well, that's pretty clear. You're not ruling out, at least, the idea of getting out of the convention altogether. What do you say, Chris, to those who argue and believe that membership, being a signatory of the Human Rights Convention, is a mark of a civilized society, just the ultimate mark of a compassionate modern society?
Well, let's be clear. I mean, I was a human rights campaigner. I chaired the Amnesty International group when I was at university. But to my mind, human rights is about some of the appalling things happening around the world. People being brutalized for their political views, people being put in jail without trial. It's not about saying a prisoner has the right to artificial insemination while they're in jail.
But, I mean, you know the arguments. You've heard them many times that it's a totem, certainly, but it is an example. It is a position, a high piece of altitude from which Britain and other signatories can criticise countries with poor records on human rights. You think, despite all of those arguments, you will not rule out getting out of the thing altogether?
Well, we've argued for change for a long time. We were very involved in the 12 months that passed. About 18 months ago, actually, we chaired the Council of Europe, which is the political body that sits alongside the court. We drove through a good package of reforms, but there's still a long way to go. There are currently 133,000 outstanding cases in the European Court of Human Rights. Give you some context, in the first 40 years of its existence, there were fewer than 1,000 cases in all of those years. So what we've got at the moment isn't working properly. It's getting bogged down. It's operating to a degree that I think goes far beyond any of the intentions of its originators. And we're finding human rights issues cropping up in areas of the law in the UK that most people feel are not right. I think particularly around the rights of people to stay in the UK. I've been very clear in saying that I think if you are in the UK, if you are somebody who represents a national security risk, who has committed serious crimes here and has blatant disregard for the human rights of others, it does not seem right to me that you can use the human rights argument just to justify staying in the UK.
All right. And the Prime Minister, you'll have seen this, he says there'll be no lurch to the right as a reaction to the bad result for the Tory party in Eastleigh. Just tell me why, even floating the possibility of getting out of the Human Rights Convention itself, why that is not a lurch to the right, Chris.
Well, the first thing is, if you look back at something I said in my conference speech last year, so it's nothing to do with Eastleigh. And also, this is not a left-right issue. You'll find something like 75% of the population agree with us. So this is not something that is an issue on the margins. The frustration with what we've got spreads across our society.
You aren't you, sticking to your promise to bring in payment by results when it comes to the rehabilitation of offenders. Why are you so hot on this idea? When it comes to payment by results for finding people work, it hasn't been a success.
Well, I think that actually the progress so far with our work programme in my former job at the DWP has actually been pretty good, and it's getting better all the time. It had a slow start in 2011 because the economy started rather less well than had been forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility. But we're now in a position where more than 200,000 people have started jobs through the work programme, where the number of people coming off benefits is exactly in line with expectations. That's good progress. And of course, what we're doing is not what people have criticised governments for over the years, which is to just write a cheque to external contractors and not be certain of getting results. We're saying we'll only pay you if you're successful. And of course, one of the things that's baffled me, Margaret Hodge, who's chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, who I have to say I don't think is taking a proper and dispassionate view of her job in that role. It's a really important Commons job to take a look at whether government's spending money wisely. She's been very critical, but what does she want me to do? Does she want a situation where we just write a cheque to contractors, or does she want a situation where we actually get best value for taxpayers' money and say we'll only pay you when you're successful? I think the latter is a much better deal for the taxpayer.
But hold on, are you suggesting that Margaret Hodge, chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, the main spending watchdog at Westminster, are you saying she's using her office as chairman as a kind of a political instrument?
I'm saying precisely that. I mean, it's been very ironic hearing her attack the Department for Work and Pensions. She was an employment minister in the last government. She set up schemes under the previous government which proved to be pretty poor value for money. What we're doing is not guaranteeing to pay our providers in full until they've delivered results for us. And I think that's a much better place for government to be. It encourages them to do the best possible job for either the long-term unemployed or in future to try and help prevent offenders from reoffending. They know they'll only get paid in full when they're successful.
I'm just not used to hearing this sort of, a party political argument in this context. I mean, you're saying you don't have faith in Margaret Hodge as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the big spending watchdog. If that's how you feel, do any of your colleagues feel the same way?
Elsewhere in government, yes, absolutely. But I think what my message to Margaret Hodge would be is, if you want us to get a good deal for the taxpayer, recognise it when we are. We are putting providers under pressure in the employment field. I will be expecting providers in the welfare, in the reoffending area, to deliver excellent results for government. They will know they're not going to be paid in full unless they do.
Yeah, I'm struck by your criticism of Margaret Hodge. We've had a number of chairmen of public accounts in my time. They've all commanded respect. David Davis, when he was chair, Labour's Bob Sheldon, you remember him, he was very widely respected. You're saying that she's broken the tradition of impartiality, and that not just you but other cabinet ministers have lost faith in her.
Well, I think we find that sometimes the process of the committee and the way she steers it is more political grandstanding than proper independent authority.
But there are Conservatives on that committee.
Well, yes, but she's the one who directs most of the critique, I have to say.
All right. Spending. The budget's coming up. Very, very important. A number of ministers are going to be fighting their corner. Phil Hammond, Defence Secretary. Vince Cable tells us he's shop steward of the National Union of Ministers. Are you a member of that union?
I think it's a slight exaggeration. Look, I mean, when you go into a spending review period, everybody will be negotiating hard to try and make sure they protect their areas. There's nothing illogical about that. We all recognise collectively we've got to make savings. We're all working at the best possible ways of doing so. But we also have to recognise that there reaches a point where you can't simply slice things off the top. You have to change your ways of doing things. And you'll see in the spending review a mix of ideas from departments about how we can change the way government does things, more for less as we call it, but also a debate about whether there are areas which we need to protect because there are particular pressures that we recognise and we believe that we actually need to look after those areas.
Yeah. Now you've left work and pensions, is there room for a much tougher squeeze on welfare spending, which I guess you would have been defending if you were still work and pensions secretary?
Well, look, I think that the welfare state is by far the biggest part of government spending. It would be odd if going to a spending review we weren't asking questions again about other ways of getting more value for what we're spending.
So you can squeeze that budget harder?
Well, it's also about ways of ensuring that people are less dependent on welfare. And, our big theme has been trying to get people back into work, to create all the right incentives to get people into work. And the more we can do that, clearly the more money we can save that can be spent on other services.
And finally, before you go, Chris, there's no reason why you should be left out of this. Do you fancy the job of leader of the Tory party? Just about everyone else seems to.
Look, we've got a very good leader. He's going to lead us into the next election, and I very much hope he's going to be there until at least 2020.
Just wondered if he was going to bite on that last one there. You never know. He's a very civilised sort of guy, Chris Grayling, but he might as well have been wearing knuckle dusters for this interview. Some of your reaction. Tell us what you think. 85058 if you want to send us a text or at JP on Politics. Send us what you think on Twitter. This is from Nick. The problem is, as you say, he says,